Well, hello everyone. I wanted to make a lecture, a video lecture, to cover some material that this chapter, the personality chapter, in my opinion, could have done a lot better job on, and that is how to assess personality. Now, if you go through this chapter, you're going to find a lot of material on the different personality theories, the trait approach, the behavioral approach, and all the rest, the Freudian approach, and so on and so forth. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how we assess personality. And so that's really what I want to begin here, assessing personality from our personality chapter. So believe it or not, to me, assessing personality is truly applying psychology. It is psychology in action. So much of what we cover is theory, but this here is psychology being applied. How do we assess personality? And folks, we do this when we turn around and hire someone, when we assess their personality, when we're interviewing them, when we're getting interviewed for a job. When we meet someone for the first time, we're assessing their personality, and clinicians do it too. I mean, the clinical psychologist does it as well. You assess personality. So that's sort of the framework I want to talk about, is assessing personality from the clinical psychologist standpoint. Some of these things do apply to other scenarios, but that's what I have in mind. So let's say you're thinking of becoming a psychologist, a clinician, a counselor, maybe even a psychiatrist, and you're sitting down with a client for the first time. These are some of the things that you do. This is psychology in action. Now, one of the first things we do is we rely on observation. We observe behavior. We observe behavior when we meet someone for the first time, and we definitely do it when we're working in a clinical setting. Now, we look for what people do. We look for what people don't do. And a lot of us have been told not to always trust this. I mean, first impressions, you can be fooled. You know, don't judge a book by its cover. You'll hear that kind of thing. I'm here to tell you what the research actually says about that. And the research actually says that you're probably better at that, assessing personality based off observation, than you think. For example, if you meet someone and after a short while you start to draw an opinion of them, you could be wrong. But if your gut says that this is a trustworthy person or a not trustworthy person, there's a good chance, based on what you've observed, there's a good chance that it's, you go with it. You don't turn your back on what you've learned. You go with that feeling. That's what it's all about. So don't give up on observations. Another way that psychologists and others determine what a person is like personality-wise is to interview them. And a lot of times, if you sit down with a client or even in a job interview, it's very simple. You ask direct questions of someone, and that's the whole idea. You ask direct questions. Tell me about yourself. You know, are you feeling so sad that you feel like you want to hurt yourself? Do you ever see things that other people don't see, or hear things other people don't hear? These are very direct questions that you can ask people, and so on and so forth, to find out about their personality. And it's a great way. Now, its biggest drawback is that people sometimes lie. They're not honest with you. And one way to get around that, it's a little tricky, is to use a technique called leading questions. We don't do this very often, but leading questions are questions that have an obvious answer. And sometimes, if you worry that people are not being honest with you in an interview, especially in a clinical setting where you're trying to assess a person's personality, you can use leading questions. I remember one example of a gentleman who was possibly schizophrenic, but they couldn't tell. And so they asked some questions such as, how many legs does a dog have? And what direction does the sun set in the evening? And what color is the sun? And I think the person responded that a dog has about 100 legs, and that the sun is blood red, and it sets in the south. And just bizarre answer after bizarre answer, and so on. And I didn't handle this particular case, but in the end, it was so apparent that this person was not suffering from schizophrenia. What? Well, that's because even a schizophrenic knows that a dog has four legs. And the schizophrenic knows the sun sets in the west, not the south. So this person was trying so hard to fake it that it made it very clear they were missing leading questions, questions that had a very obvious answer. And so in the end, it was determined that this person was not suffering from schizophrenia. And in fact, they were not. The last thing that a lot of people will do, a lot of clinicians will do, is they will use a rating scale. Now, when you sit down as a psychiatrist or a clinician or a counselor and you sit down one-on-one with a client, you often have some pre-designed form, some paperwork that you have to fill out, and you do it the same for everybody. This is what we might refer to as a behavioral assessment or a rating scale. And by filling out the form the same way for everyone, it gives you what's called reliability. Your approach is more reliable. And so you can write it up. And sometimes you can even come up with a numerical score depending upon how your rating scale is determined. And this is a way to help you determine what a person's personality is like. Now, just because you rely on these, let's say you're a clinician or a psychiatrist or a counselor, and you are good at observation and you know how to do and conduct an interview and you know how to fill out, a rating scale assessment form, doesn't mean that you cannot be fooled. And you still can be fooled, unfortunately. So there are other methods out there. There is, for example, what is called a personality inventory. A personality inventory often is a paper and pencil survey. I don't like to call it a test. I was taught that in grad school. You don't call it a test because the test infers that there are right or wrong answers. There are no right or wrong answers with an inventory. A lot of times these things you fill out on your own. They're self-reporting in nature, and a lot of times they do them sometimes on computers and sometimes by paper and pencil. It slows people down to do it by paper and pencil, and so they have to give it a little bit more thought than just a point and click type of response. Now, there's a lot of different types of personality inventories out there. For example, there is one referred to as the NEO Personality Inventory, okay, created by Robert Costa and Paul McRae. It's still in use today, probably created just a mere 20 years ago. Paul Costa and Robert McRae are still with us and teaching away. Basically, this NEO PI, Personality Inventory, and the R stands for revised, is based off of the Big Five, the five-factor theory of personality. You might have seen it in the book. I think they used the abbreviation CANOE or OCEAN as a way of the Big Five, and this tool is created off of it. This is a personality inventory designed to figure out a person's personality. Okay. There's also one created by Raymond Cattell called the 16 Personality Factor Questionnaire. It feels that you can determine a lot of a person's personality based off 16 particular factors, and I think the book talks about that. So these are two well-known personality inventories, ways to help you assess personality. They are both very good for different purposes, but probably the premier one is this one right here, the MMPI version 2. The Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory version 2. That's what this is, okay? This here is a way to determine a person's personality. And what it does, it consists of, get this, over 500 statements. I believe it's 550 statements that you have to answer. And to each of these statements, you answer either true, false, or cannot say, okay? True, false, or cannot say. So this thing is very, very thorough, designed to determine your personality. And what are some of the statements? Here are some of the sample statements from the very first version that they use as examples for version 2, and I'm allowed to share these with you. Sometimes I hear things other people cannot hear. True, false, or cannot say. I am happy all the time. True, false, or cannot say. Sometimes I laugh at a dirty joke. True, false, or cannot say. Some of you are probably grinning right now. He posted the phrase dirty joke online there, okay? How you respond to these and 545 more statements, they can determine your personality. Now, this thing is very thorough. And in fact, there are 10 specialty scales that, based on your 550 answers, they can rate you on. And believe it or not, I've always told people the MMPI 2 is very easy to administer, and it's actually quite easy to score. It is just an absolute bear to interpret, okay? You can't say, well, you're high here and you're low there. You're high here, you're mediocre there. You have to formulate that into a personality. And to be honest with you, that's beyond my pay scale. I never have done that kind of stuff, but the people who do it tend to be very good. The MMPI is so good, in fact, that it has built into it what are called validity scales. There are 8 validity scales built into this thing. And these validity scales, there's like a lie score. If you miss leading questions enough, it will determine the probability that you're lying. There's a cannot say scale. If you answer cannot say too many times, you're evasive. There is a fake good scale. You're trying to make yourself look better than you are. There's a fake bad scale. There's a correction scale. You don't need to write all those scales down. But this thing is very, very detailed, and it tends to be a good product overall. There are lots of other personality inventories. They are hard to fake your way through. I'm going to back up here for just a second. I will say this about the MMPI 2, version 2. It does have one shortcoming. It is designed to gauge abnormal behavior. The NEOPI that I showed you earlier, the 16 personality factor questionnaire, those are designed to gauge just personality. This is designed to gauge abnormal behaviors in your personality. And quite honestly, it's sometimes misused for purposes other than that. Which I wish it wasn't, but unfortunately it is. And so that definitely can be a problem in that regard. Now, through all of that, 500 plus questions, through an observation, through leading questions, through an interview, through rating scales, and all of that, is it possible that people could still fake a personality that is not them? It's possible. One last method you can use is called a projective test. Now, with the projective tests, these tests are designed so that it's very hard to create a personality that is not your own. It's very hard to fake an answer. I want to pretend that I'm schizophrenic. I want to pretend that I'm this or I'm that. With the projective test, that's difficult to do because you can't always tell what the psychiatrist or clinician is looking for. You can't tell by the questions what they're after. And the idea behind a projective test is that people project their personality through their answer, and they don't even realize they're doing it. They have no idea. They're not even aware that they're giving away their personality because they can't tell what you're looking for. Now, there are two major examples of projective tests. One is what is called the Rorschach ink blot test, and the other is called the thematic apperception test, also known as the TAT. Now, I want to talk about each of these, and I'm going to do them one at a time here in this regard, okay? For the most part, let's go ahead and talk about the Rorschach. This here is Herman Rorschach. Herman Rorschach basically was a psychiatrist. He wondered often why people can look at obscure things, such as clouds in the sky, and see different things. Why do people not always see the exact same thing? Why do you have to press them to, well, do you see this or do you see that? Oh, well, now that you pointed it out, yes, I do. So Rorschach turned around and got this idea. He took pieces of paper and he poured ink onto these sheets. He would then take the piece of paper and he would fold it in two, and then he would press it together so that the ink that was in there got pressed out in different directions. Okay? This was the making of what was called the Rorschach ink blot test. What you would do then is you take those sheets of paper, and before they completely dried, you pull them back apart, and you would have designs such as you see here. There were quite a few cards that were in black and white. Herman Rorschach went with 5, and he used the same 5 pretty much all the time. He also created quite a few cards that were in color, where he poured different colors of ink on the card, folded the paper together, and then basically made quite a few colored cards that were in color. And he would use 5 of these, 5 in black and white and 5 in color. And what you would do is you would show these cards to a client, one at a time. And you would ask the client, tell me what you see in the picture. So take a look at these two for a couple of moments. Stop this video if you have to. Pause it and ask yourself, what do you see in these pictures? Okay? All right. So, whatever you see is your own choice. I've had people tell me all sorts of things. Some of them I can't even share here in a video. I'd rather not. The idea is that if you see the same thing as somebody who has depression, then maybe you're depressed. If you see the same thing as someone who's schizophrenic, then maybe you're schizophrenic. If you see the same thing as someone who has a particular personality disorder, then maybe you have a personality disorder. That is the premise of the Rorschach. Now you got to ask yourself, how valid do you think this approach is? If you said probably not very valid, then you're right. The overall validity of the Rorschach ink blot test is not very good. It has been brought into question quite a bit. Just because you see the same thing as someone who's suffering from depression doesn't mean that you're depressed. The validity there is just simply not very good. But this is one type of projective test that's out there. There's also what is called the TAT, the Thematic Apperception Test. The TAT consists of 30 cards, okay? Now, typically, you use 20 of these cards, and you're supposed to use the same 20. Now, with these cards, they are not ink blots. They are pictures. And these pictures, quite honestly, are meant to be controversial. Okay, for college students here, so I chose this one to show you. Picture of a man standing there, as you can see. He has his hand over his eyes. A woman is laying in bed. You can't tell if she's asleep or if she's dead or unconscious or what. She is bare-chested. It's vague, and it's meant to be. And what you do is you show these one at a time, and you ask the client, tell me a story. Tell me what's going on in this picture, okay? Tell me what you think has happened. You don't just tell me what you see, you tell me a story in this picture. And the idea is that you do this for 20 cards, of which the 20th card, okay, is completely blank. It's just completely blank. And I have actually learned how to administer the TAT. When you administer the TAT and you administer the Rorschach, for both, you are to write down, you're the clinician, you're the psychiatrist, you are to write down everything that a person says, hopefully word for word. With today's videotape technology, it's made it worlds easier that you can turn around and videotape things and videotape a session, let the client know you're doing it, and that way you don't miss anything. You're supposed to even write down times gone by if a person was uncomfortable with card 12, or they laughed out loud at card 6. Or they thought card 18 was one that they didn't even want to physically touch, something like that. You would make note of that, all right? The idea behind the TAT is that you look for trends. You look for reoccurring themes. Does a person turn around and constantly see bad things? Do they see good things? Do they give you answers that are similar pretty much time after time after time? The overall validity of the TAT is probably better, it is better, than the Rorschach. But it's still not the greatest in the world. It really, unfortunately, is not. And so with that being the case, it might get used to help verify what you already know. but you're not going to start with it. You're not going to start with the Rorschach. You're not going to start with the TAT. These tests are probably the most controversial. Projective tests are the most controversial as far as their overall validity and so on. But here they are. Okay, you might use it to help verify what you're already thinking. That's a way that it has been used before. But here you have it. These are some of the ways to turn around and determine personality. You can rely on observation. You should. You can do interviews. You can assess it by writing it all down into an assessment form, a rating scale. You can do inventories, personality inventories, and even projective tests as needed. Okay? These get you started on the way of becoming a clinician, a counselor, a social worker, how to interview people. You might not use testing like this type for interviewing people for jobs, but it's what we do. All right, folks, that's all I got for you. Keep up the great work.